Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Boozer with CUGC HQ, and it is my pleasure to welcome you today to our latest user share with Daniel Feller. It's going to be a XenApp and XenDesktop tech update. And I know a lot of people are very excited to hear about this. Just briefly, our format today will have Daniel's presentation, and it'll be followed by your Q&A discussion. If you would, please type your questions into the question area of the GoToWebinar control panel. Our moderator will read through them and help Daniel with reading the questions and getting the answers as soon as he's all done. Also, I want to let you know that this presentation is being recorded and it will be posted on mycugc.org afterwards for you guys to watch again. Our moderator today is CTP and CUGC Steering Committee Vice President Tobias Kreidl. And I will let Tobias come on and tell you a little bit about himself and then introduce Daniel.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm so glad that all of you could be here to attend. The timing certainly couldn't be better with the release of XenDesktop and XenApp 7.11 just being yesterday. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Daniel Feller, who is a Citrix Lead Architect with the Desktop and Applications Group. He has something like 20 years of experience in this area and has participated in many different deployments and has taken on a number of different roles with Citrix. He graduated from Purdue University and started out as an IT admin deploying WinFrame and MetaFrame 1.0, so in the very, very early days before it eventually got the XenApp name. He then joined Citrix Consulting as one of its very first consultants and spent over a decade working on some of the world's largest and most complex environments. So it is a pleasure to have him here today to tell us about many of the exciting and interesting product enhancements that have appeared in XenApp and XenDesktop. And so without further ado, Daniel, please take it away and welcome.
Hey, thanks a lot, Tobias. So yeah, so basically I've been around a while. Tobias, you made me feel a little old, but back in the WinFrame days. But yeah, that's basically where I got my start at Citrix Technologies, back with WinFrame 1.7. So I've been doing this for quite a while. But you know, we're not going to talk about old stuff. We're going to talk about new stuff today, and that's really what the basis of the tech update is. There's so many different things that are happening, and how quickly things are coming about that. This tech update session came about just because of that. How do we get this information across as fast as possible? Because there's a lot, and so this is the September 2016 edition, and I have volume 11 there because this is the 11th version of the tech update session I've done. So each time I do it, I make sometimes very significant changes. Like today is a very major change that I've made to this whole deck. But overall, it's just a matter of let's get through as much of the updates that we have. So it's been 7 months since I did the last CUGC tech update session, and a lot has happened since then. We had Citrix Energy. We had the final BRI forum, for those of you who weren't aware of that. XenApp, XenDesktop 7.8 was released, 7.9 was released. As Tobias said today, 7.11 was released. Citrix acquired the ComTrade SCOM management packs, as well as the NorScale user environment management as well. So this is all that's happened, the major headlines over the last 7 months. I probably forgot a few here, but so a lot's happened, and basically we have a lot to discuss. So let's get into it. But first, big thanks to all these other experts out here. So like I said, I'm like the voice of these tech updates, but a lot of the information, a lot of the testing, a lot of the best practices I get from our test teams, from our consulting teams, from our CTPs, and I do like to give them, big thanks, for providing me this information so I can share it to all of you. So first is what's new. So I break this session into what's new, what's better and what's best. So new is being new things, better are things that have been improved since the last time, and then best is some of the best practices. And there's a lot of best practices, but I can't go over all of them, so just be a couple of the newer ones that have come about since the last time I've done this. So the first thing is the biggest news that I have, in this entire tech update. So if there's one thing you want to pay attention to, it's right now. And usually keep this at the end because you want people to stick around, but I figure I'd do it right now. So are you ready? Are you ready for the big news? So this works better when I can see people and I can hear everyone just start yelling yes. So it's hard to do on the phone, but are you really sure you're ready? So pay attention, because the big news is that the Citrix VDI handbook is in final review. This thing is going to be done in about a week or two, and we're going to be releasing it. So I've gotten so much feedback from many of you asking, hey, when's the next update going to be to the handbook? Because it's been actually quite a few years since this thing's changed. So it is being worked on. It's in final review. It's all written. Just getting feedback from the consultants about some of the new best practices are in there. Then we'll be able to finalize this and get it published out. So just so you know, the plan for this is that we're going to do it with Ltsr releases. So like Tobias said, XenApp and XenDesktop 7.11 were released today. That's a current release, but not an Ltsr, not a long-term service ring release. Those will happen every 1 to 2 years, and that's when we'll keep revising the VDI handbook. Just because we need time to develop the best practices and recommendations. So for instance, today 7.11 came out. It adds support for Windows Server 2016. We don't have sizing information yet on Windows Server 2016 yet because Windows Server 2016 is coming out now, so we don't have any real-world implementations to build best practices. So that's why we're going to only update this with Ltsr, so we make sure all the recommendations here are valid. So the next thing that's new, and this is with 7.11, is something called Hdx Adaptive Display. So take a look at a typical website. You're going to have something like this. And if you break this down and analyze what's on the screen, what you end up seeing is that you have video content or 3D graphics, something that's going to be changing quite frequently. A lot of graphical interactions that's going to happen here. You also have images, JPEG images, just static images that aren't changing. And you also have text, which is highlighted in blue. So most web pages that you see are going to have 2 or all 3 of these things on the same page. So when we talk about Citrix Hdx and which codec to use, you get into this complete craziness of what's the best one. What should I be using for my users? Because you have ThinWire, ThinWire Plus, H.264, FrameHawk, all these different codecs that you can use, and they each have a different purpose. So for instance, H.264 is really good at video, but you don't want to use it for text and static images because there's a CPU hit with H.264. You really want to do it with video. So how do you say this user is going to use H.264 even though they're not using video that often? But when there is video, we want them to use 264. But when there's not, we want them to use something else. So that's what Hdx Adaptive Display is going to do for us. So if we go back to this web page, what ends up happening here is Hdx is going to look at the screen and figure out, okay, this portion of the screen highlighted in green is video content or 3D graphics. I'm going to translate this with H.264 because it's really good for video, but there's a higher CPU usage when you use this. So you're going to get less scalability by doing H.264. So we want to limit how much of our session is being encoded with H.264. So we're only going to encode that video portion. And then we're going to look at everything else and say, okay, are there any static images? If so, we will encode this with ThinWire or ThinWire Plus, because this is going to give you the really good image, but it's not going to have a high of a CPU cost. So it should help increase our server density. And then finally, we have text. And for this, all these H.264 and ThinWire, they work by compressing the image or doing lossy compression where you lose some of the clarity, but because things happen so fast, things move so fast, you don't notice the clarity degradation. But with text, you will. You really need very crisp letters to make reading a lot easier. So when we identify text, we encode it a different way to give you that nice crisp look. So that's what Hdx Adaptive Display is. So you don't have to pick which codec you want to use that's applied to the entire session. Adaptive Display will use multiple codecs and only use them where necessary within your session. So that's one of the new features with the 7.11 release. The next thing is self-service password reset. I guess you could say this is more of a what's better as opposed to what's new, but it's really new for the FMA architecture as opposed to IMA. And it's a little different than back what we had with IMA. So, many of you are probably familiar with self-service password reset, is that, I might forget my password or I might lock myself out. So I've been at Citrix for enough years that I have changed my Citrix password 50 to 60 times because, like most people, we have an Active Directory policy that says your password must be changed every 90 days, which I've done. So I've changed this thing 50 or 60 times. I've never forgotten my password, but I've locked my account out numerous times because what happens is I'll change my password, when I log into my virtual desktop, but my phone and my tablet or other devices still have my old saved password in there. And next thing you know, they're all trying to sync email and they get a password denied error. And if they all happen very similar times, I've now done my password wrong 3 times and now my account's locked out. It's not that I forgot my password, it's just that I have all these other devices that are also using the same password and I didn't change those passwords yet because I haven't got around to it. So normally it would be a case of me having to call the support desk, hey, unlock my account, and doing all that, which takes a few minutes, or you just go in through Storefront and unlock your account through the self-service password reset. So how this works is the first thing you got to do is enroll as a user. So when you implement it and when you turn this on, what you end up seeing in Storefront, there's a new item at the top. We have favorites and desktop and apps. Now there's a task item. And inside there's just one item, which is manage your security questions. So in order for me to unlock or reset my password, I have to be able to answer other questions like, what's your favorite color? What's your favorite song? Or something like that, multiple questions to prove who I am. Once you answer those questions, then you're able to reset or unlock your account. But this is what the manage security questions item here in the task does. It lets you answer the questions that your administrator has identified that they want to have to help secure the environment. Now, the architecture for this is the user is going to contact Storefront over TLS encryption, just like they normally do. From Storefront, you can then do account self-service. There's an item there for account self-service, and that's going to then talk to this self-service password reset service. And it's just a service, a small service you install on a server. And Storefront will talk to that service. Now, that service first will communicate with your central store, and this is just a file share. It's going to do this over SMB. But you need to specify a data proxy account, and all this account is just an Active Directory account you've identified that has access to the central store, because that's where the user's answers to those security questions are going to be stored encrypted. So the data proxy account has to contact the central store to verify that the user questions, the security questions that the user answered are valid against the central store. So that account doesn't really need that many rights, just needs access to the central store, being able to read and write to it, to the file share. The self-service password reset service also needs access to Active Directory because it has to unlock accounts as well as reset account passwords. And for this, you're going to set up a different Active Directory account, the self-service account. And again, this is just another AD account that just has rights to do account unlocks and password changes. And so the SSPR service will then use that account to be able to interact with Active Directory. So that's all there is to the self-service password reset component within the 7.11 release. Another thing that's new, so this was actually 7.9 release, is Federated Authentication Service. And so this gets more into authentication. And how authentication currently works, how pretty much almost everyone's doing it right now who use XenApp and XenDesktop is you have a receiver, your browser, your external, you contact NetScaler Gateway. and you enter in your credentials. Gateway is going to go ahead and authenticate you against Active Directory, and if you're allowed in, it's going to then forward your request on the storefront, which can also authenticate you against Active Directory, which then talks to the delivery controller and say, hey, give me the list of resources that this user has. From there, the user has an ICA ticket that proves their identity they can get through Gateway, and that will be able to launch their VDA, their application, or their virtual desktop. When they access that resource will then, again, authenticate them to Active Directory. So the problem you run into with this, because this works great, and this is how it's worked for years, but now imagine you have a Chromebook, and with Chromebooks you log into Google. So you log into Google, you get onto your Chromebook, and then you connect to Storefront. Now I have to log in again, but this time I'm logging into Active Directory. So the user now has to remember 2 different accounts and passwords. The other option with the Federated Authentication service is that you log into Google, and then your Google account is used to log you into Storefront. And then from there you can go ahead and access your resources. So the thing to remember here is that even though we're using Google to authenticate us, Active Directory is still a requirement. There's still AD in the back end. Just because we're running on top of Windows, Windows is going to require Active Directory to authenticate users. So if we go back to the overall architecture, what we end up changing is that we have a third-party identity provider. In this instance, it's Google, but it could be anything. It could be Azure Active Directory. It could even be something like LinkedIn for your identity provider. Instead of NetScaler authenticating against Active Directory, it would authenticate against your third-party identity provider via a SAML trust, which it's able to support. So when you're authenticated to that, what ends up happening is the user will contact Storefront because NetScaler is letting you in because you have authenticated your third-party provider, but the problem is Storefront does not know who your AD account is, and Storefront's trying to authenticate you against AD. So something has to be done here to make this work. So what's been added is something called the Citrix Federated Authentication Service, and this relies on Microsoft Certificate Services. So you can basically think of the Citrix Federated Authentication Service as a virtual smart card. And for smart card authentication, you use Microsoft Certificate Services. So this virtual smart card is the Citrix service that's basically going to create virtual smart cards on the fly for the user. So if you look at how this works, is that the user authenticates to NetScaler Gateway, which the authentication backend is your third-party identity provider. If that is accepted, if you have authenticated, then NetScaler will pass you on to Storefront and say, hey, this person's authenticated, they're validated. Storefront now has this logon data provider component that will create a virtual smart card on the user's behalf. Then when the user logs in to the VDA and connects to the VDA, the VDA has to authenticate to Active Directory. It will use a credential plugin that authenticates to that virtual smart card on the Citrix Federated Authentication Service. It then goes and authenticates with Active Directory. So Active Directory is still there. We're just masking that authentication with a virtual smart card based on the user's identity from the third-party identity provider like Google or LinkedIn or Azure Active Directory or something like that. So it's a solution for people who are using a third-party identity provider and don't want to have their users have to remember an Active Directory account and password. So that was something that came out in the previous release, 7.9, but I don't think a lot of people were aware of it, so I thought I'd cover that as well.
Daniel, sorry for the interruption, yeah. But there are a number of questions regarding authentication, in particular whether or not, for example, having a NetScaler front end is absolutely necessary in order to be able to use federated authentication.
Yeah, NetScaler is the requirement there, because that is authenticating us to a third-party provider. Storefront wouldn't be able to do that, and NetScaler has that functionality. Okay, so the next thing is zones. So I put this as what's better, because so we've had zones for 1 or 2 releases now, and basically, for those of you who are familiar with like XenApp 6.5, you're familiar with zones. With the early, the early FMA, the early 7.x releases, there was no concept of zones. So if you had multiple sites, you would have complete implementations in all these sites. That would include SQL databases, delivery controllers, and your resources. But with the implementation of zones, you now support a multi-site implementation with XenApp and XenDesktop. And basically, what happens here is you have satellite zones. Those delivery controllers and those satellite zones will talk to the central SQL database. Now, just because we have zones doesn't mean you use zones everywhere. So for instance, let's say I had a satellite zone with 5,000 users. Would I make that a zone, or would I make it its own separate implementation? And so we have some recommendations on the size of your sites as well as the network connection. How much bandwidth do you need, and how much latency can you tolerate to be able to handle zones of a certain size? So for instance, if you have 50 users or less, you don't need that much bandwidth, and you can have a lot of latency to support something like that. But as soon as you start adding hundreds and thousands of users, you need a lot more bandwidth, and you need very low latency, because all the delivery controllers at your remote sites has to talk to your central database to log a user in, to find a resource for the user. If you don't have a lot of bandwidth, or you have a lot of latency, that's going to take a lot longer for the delivery controller to figure out what resource that user should go to. It's going to increase the time the user has to wait. And as you add more users to it, it adds to this latency or the time the user has to wait. So zones is a great solution for, if you've got a small site, with 50 users, you don't want to implement an entire XenApp or XenDesktop environment in that site, because SQL licenses can be expensive. So here it's very easy. Make it a zone, integrate it with your headquarters data center. Even if you had 1,000 users, you could still make that a site, a satellite site, just as long as you have enough bandwidth and your latency is low enough. And it's totally feasible depending on your overall network topology. Building on the zones is something new with 7.11 is zone preferences. And so the zone preferences works, and it does this evaluation flow of figuring out, it first looks at the application. Does the app have a home? Should this app only run in a single, in a certain zone? Does the user have a home? Where is the user's home zone? And then where is the user location? Where is the user physically located at? And so the reason why you would use these different ones is basically it's all about the data. If the application has back-end data, that back-end data is specific to the application, so think of a line of business application, then you're going to go with the application home for that resource. But if the app has back-end data that's based on the user account, then you use a user home. So for instance, think of Outlook. Outlook has a back-end data file, your cache data file, but that's based on the user. So that's based on where the user's, maybe home drive is located. That's where your Outlook cache file is going to be. So in this instance, you'd want to use the user home for the zone preference for that particular resource. And then there might be applications like a browser where you don't have any back-end data requirements. So here you want the app to run in the data center that is physically closer to the user. So if the user's traveling, if I'm in Europe, I don't want to use my Fort Lauderdale data center for, Firefox. I'd rather use the one that's in Europe because it's closer, give me a better experience. There's no back-end data that's going to, hurt the experience. So this whole evaluation flow, works down from home, app home, user location, and as soon as one of these has been set for the resource you're trying to access, the evaluation stops. And so if app home is set for this resource, it's only going to use app home. It's not going to then look at the user home and then try to figure out, okay, where do I want to use this at? So if you look at the flow of how this works, is we have an app home, a user home, and a user location. One of these is going to help us pick our preferred zone. Now, once we've figured out a preferred zone, we have preferred and non-preferred zones for this particular resource. Now, how you how the system decides where to run your session is based on some criteria. First thing it's going to try to do is reconnect you to a session in your preferred zone. If you don't already have a session running in your preferred zone, it'll try to reconnect you to a session in a non-preferred zone. Because the whole premise here is we want to save on resources. And this is the default config. If you don't have a session already running in your preferred or non-preferred zone, it's going to create a new session in your preferred zone. If it can't do that, it's going to go to your non-preferred zone and try to do a session roaming, one of those smooth roaming instances. If you don't have a session running in your non-preferred zone, it's going to then create a new session in your non-preferred zone. So it's trying to keep you in your preferred zone as well as save resources. So that's the default config, but there's also the no fallback config, which basically says this resource can only run in my preferred zone. I want you to first try to reconnect to a session. If the user doesn't have a session already running, then I want you to start a brand new session. If I can't start a brand new session because I don't have any resources, then the user doesn't get the resource. So that's what the no fallback option is for zone preferences. So that zone preferences is something, this is how zones has expanded to include new functionality with the 7.11 release. The next thing is monitoring. So, we've had director monitoring for a while, and this is, some improvements that have been done with 7.11 is looking at historical monitoring. So we have some real-time monitoring. Now we're looking at historical monitoring, and also looking at process monitoring as well. So when we look in director, what we end up seeing is that, you have the real-time monitoring for a machine as well as machine catalog and your other resources. So you can look at average CPU, average memory, total sessions that are running. And you also can see the top 10 processes that are happening, for that particular virtual desktop, or for that particular virtual desktop, and then look at how much CPU and memory is running for those top 10 processes. But when you look at this, so how this is samples, so there's different sampling periods that happen now. For CPU and memory, we're sampling every 5 seconds. And then the control, or the VDA, every virtual desktop or resource is going to then upload that information to the controller every minute. So when you're on a controller and when the controller is looking at this information, it's only every minute of these sampling periods. Even though it's sampling every 5 seconds, we only upload every minute. So that's when you see the update. Process data, we only sample once a minute, and we only upload it to the controller every 5 minutes. And if you think about it, it's because you'd overwhelm the controller if you did this every 5 seconds or every second and keep uploading data to your controllers. You'd cause too much resource utilization on your virtual desktops as well as on the controllers, and hurt your scalability. So this is how you kind of start summarizing it. Now when you move into more of the historical reporting on this, the summaries change a little bit. So for resources, for that first day, you'll have a sample for every minute of that day. For 7 days, for the next 7 days, it'll be one sample for every 10 minutes. So it's the average over at 10 minutes, and you have multiple of those at 10-minute intervals. At 30 days, it's a sample every hour, and at 90 days, it's every 24 hours or every 1 day. So when you go to the 90 days or more report, what you're seeing is samples for every 24 hours. It's the average. Process is very similar, except at the day, it's 5-minute data intervals, and then it's at 3 days, which is a 20-minute data interval, and then it goes 30 and 90 days. Each sample is either 80 or 70 bytes based on whether you're looking at resources or processes. So now you can start thinking, it's like, okay, if I want to have a sample from this, from like 1,000 VDAs, how much storage space am I going to need in the database? And so we have really fun formulas here to figure this out. And it's actually really easy. You just plug in the VDAs. You just plug in how many VDAs you're talking about, how many virtual desktops you're talking about. And that's going to tell you over 90 days how much data in bytes are you going to have to account for. You're going to have to find some storage for. So I figured I'd run through this a little bit, what the results would be if you did it for 100, 500, or 1,000 virtual desktops. The blue is resource data, and the green is process data. So you can turn either of those off You can turn them both off. You can turn one of them off. So it's up to you whether you want per resource data, process data, or both. But this is how much space, storage space, is going to be required for 1,000 or 100, 500, or 1,000 virtual desktops over 90 days. So as you can see, resource data isn't that bad. 1,000 VDAs over 90 days is 250 megabytes. But the process data is 8 gig. So it's much more substantial with the process data. And the whole reason for this is that, like I said, it's only capturing process data for the reports that you see are only for the top 10 processes. But it is capturing 100 processes for every session, the top 100. So because your top 10 might not always be the top 10, so we need to make sure that we collect enough data in case some of those other processes don't, aren't in the top 10, but every so often they might rise up there. So we want to try to capture the top 100 processes for each session during each sampling period. So when you do the historical monitoring of the resources, try to monitor, figure out how much storage space you need. And like I said, you can turn on and off what you're collecting via, the Citrix policies within Studio. The other thing that's been changed quite a bit, so this was, 7.9, XenApp and XenDesktop 7.9 is storage. So with machine creation services, there's this, where's the storage go? And so the UI has been changed a little bit, trying to make things a little more clear and let you configure the storage a little bit more as well. So the first thing is, let's say you went with the default shared storage. This is what it's going to look like. You will have your OS disk on shared storage. That's your master image. Your VMs running on your hypervisor. And then those VMs will be contacting your identity and your differencing disk that's also stored on your shared storage, the same place where your OS disk is. That's the default config. So if you look at provisioning services, it can do the same thing. You can have your OS disk on shared storage that the Pvs server is grabbing, and your VMs will write to a write cache disk that's on shared storage. So it can do the exact same architecture. However, do you really want to put temporary data, data you want to throw away on shared storage? So with MCS, we can now, there's this button here that says optimize temporary data on available local storage. And how this changes the architecture is that instead of having a differencing disk for each VM on shared storage, that differencing disk becomes a write cache disk that's now stored locally on your Zen Server, Hyper-V, or vSphere server. So we're not doing all those writes on shared storage anymore. All those writes are now happening on our local hypervisor. So hopefully we're not overloading our shared storage. And again, Pvs, look at the Pvs architecture, can do the same thing. This is something for Pvs we've been recommending for years, is put your write cache on the local storage of your hypervisor, because it's temporary data, it's stuff we're going to get rid of when the machine reboots. The next thing is a RAM-based read cache. So, with I/O activity, we have reads and writes. So for the reads, on Zen Server with MCS, we can use Zen Server RAM to give us a read cache, a RAM-based read cache. So instead of the reads, so every time these VMs have to read from the master OS disk, those will be cached on Zen Server RAM, and then we don't have to have all those reads happening back on shared storage. On the Pvs side, we've had this since the beginning of Pvs because this is simply just using Windows, the Windows Server system cache as it's reading these blocks of data from the OS disk. It's just putting them in Windows system cache. So this has been part of Pvs we've done for Pvs for ages. So again, same, very similar functionality. And so what we end up happening here is, you look at the performance metrics, with this is the blue line is Zen Server without the read, or MCS without a Zen Server based read cache. And you can see the average IOPS per user, those blue lines can be quite high. You look at Windows 8. The green line is MCS using the Zen Server read cache, and the orange line is Pvs that we've always used. So what you basically see here is that MCS is now equal to Pvs from a read-based I/O perspective, from a read-based storage I/O perspective when you're running on Zen Server. But really, what we're looking at is when we look at next is the write cache. The writes that's going to disk. So now there's a RAM-based write cache. Within MCS, as part of the configuration, you can now specify how big should your disk cache be and how big should your memory cache be. And how this changes the architecture is that now within each of the VMs we have a RAM-based write cache. So any writes that the VM has to do will be written into the VM's non-page pooled RAM. As that RAM is utilized, it will then consolidate those writes and dump them onto the write cache that's stored on the local hypervisor. So this works just like Pvs. You know, this is something we've been talking about for Pvs now for probably, I think, 2 years, 2 or 3 years now. Same type of functionality. It's all based within the VM, so it works across any hypervisor. It just is using the fast RAM to give us a user experience improvement, because instead of having to wait for the storage, the slow storage, to take care of all these writes, it's all dumped in the fast RAM, so you get a much better user experience. So MCS Pvs on the RAM-based write cache, it becomes very equal. And we look at the graphs again. This is average I/O for writes. And again, the blue line is MCS without a RAM cache, the green is MCS with a RAM cache, and the orange is Pvs with a RAM cache. And basically what you see is MCS from a writes I/O perspective is now equal to Pvs. So MCS now equals Pvs from a read-based RAM, from a read-based I/O, as well as from a write-based I/O. And so also looking at MCS so this is something new that was added into MCS with 7.11, so today is, so we're familiar with how MCS how it deploys images. So you have this master VM and a master image. When you want to deploy new virtual machines, it's going to make a copy of that master image, so it now we now have a copy of this, which is a deployable image. And that image then gets used for all of our different VMs. So we'll then build VMs. Each VM will have an identity disk and a differencing disk. All those VMs, when they boot, they read from that deployed image. It gets their identity from their unique identity disk, and then all of the writes go to the differencing disk. So all these VMs are still based on that copy of that master image. So this works pretty good. The problem you run into is that if you want to do like a dedicated desktop, how do you handle storage migration? If you have to change your storage backend, or you want to move these VMs to other servers, how is this all going to work? And it becomes difficult because you still have these linkages to that copy of that master image. So this is why now there's the support for full clone dedicated desktops. So again, the architecture stays very similar, except instead of all these VMs reading from that copy of that deployed image, now every VM gets a full copy of the deployed image, and they read and write from that full clone. They still have an identity disk, and they each have their own full clone that they read and write to. So now I can easily take that VM and those two disks associated with it and move it anywhere. I can change storage. I can change hypervisor. I can change servers that they're running on. It becomes easier to move these type of dedicated desktops around than the previous thin provision desktops. So it's been a lot of changes to MCS, but there's also been some changes on provisioning services as well. So we're all familiar, those of us who use Pvs, with how Pvs boots is. You request a DHCP, you make a DHCP request. The DHCP server sends you back your IP address plus options 66 and 67, which tells you here's your TFTP server and your boot file. Then your target device goes out to TFTP, requests the boot file, it responds with the boot file, and then you go ahead and start the Pvs logon process. This works. It can be a pain because you got to modify DHCP, which can be hard to do in large enterprises. You also, if you have multiple subnets, you have to set up IP helpers for TFTP across your different subnets. So those TFTP requests can cross your subnets. So, like I said, it works, but there's some caveats with it. So people have used this BDM. You can attach a boot file to all your target devices. It's just a bootable file, becomes your boot drive. And how this works is, again, it requests the DHCP address, it receives the IP address, but there's no more options 66 and 67 because I already have the boot file, I already have the boot information in the BDM file. But with the two-stage BDM, it still has to talk to TFTP because it has to get the Pvs device drivers that it can use to start the Pvs stream. So there's still a TFTP service involved in the old two-stage BDM file. The good thing is we got rid of the DHCP options, you don't have to set those, but you still need the IP helper files. And the other problem was there was no easy way to maintain the BDM files. So if I, spawned 1,000 VMs, 1,000 Pvs target devices with a BDM associated with it, and then I change my Pvs environment, maybe it's a new server names that I've rolled out, I then basically have to destroy all those 1,000 VMs and rebuild them to change the BDM file. Not very useful. The next part was, let's do a single stage BDM file. So again, it's attached to the device, our target device. We get the DHCP IP addresses. But because the BDM file includes the boot file plus the Pvs device drivers, we no longer need the TFTP service. It'll automatically just go ahead and contact the Pvs service and boot up. So it's faster, there's no DHCP options, there's no IP helpers, there's no TFTP servers, it supports UEFI, all these type of things. But you have to use the XenDesktop setup wizard to do this, to create the single stage BDM file. And that's just the XenDesktop setup wizard that's part of the Pvs console. So the two-stage BDM, what I said is there's no way to update that. But now this functionality has been built into the Pvs console, so it's now a centralized BDM updates. So I can go into all of my device collections and right-click on the target, right-click on a target device, new update BDM partition, and it'll go through all those target devices and rewrite the BDM partition for all those, the boot partition. And we don't have to blow away the target devices and recreate them. It's just going through and updating the BDM files or the BDM partition on each one of those target devices. So this becomes much easier on the Pvs side to deploy and maintain. Speaking of maintaining, the other thing is updating the Vdisks, and this has always been a concern when you deal with provisioning services is, let's say I need to update the Pvs agent on my master Pvs images. So as we all know, a Pvs image requires the network. It's all network-based streaming. So when I update the image and it has to update the network driver goes down for a moment. Well, the VM can't continue to function anymore because it needs the network to function. And if the network drops, the VM doesn't continue until the network comes back up. It can't finish the installation because there's no network. So you become this black hole that you struggle trying to get around. So if you look at the instructions from Pvs 7.6 and earlier, this is the instruction on how you update a Vdisk, how you update the Pvs agent within one of your Vdisk images. I shrink it to fit on this one page. So we know this has been an issue, which is why in 7.7 it shrunk quite a bit. It's not because the writers got lazy. It's just because things have been getting improved. And then in 7.8, that's what it is now, much smaller. And if you basically read it, it's start the image in private image mode, maintenance mode, and then run the Pvs agent installer. You're done. There's no reverse imaging to update the Pvs agent anymore. So that's one of the challenges with Pvs that's been taken care of in one of the previous releases that you might have missed. The other thing is Pvs supports VHD and Vhdx files. So I got a lot of this information from Dan Young, who did a lot of testing, and so I went through and kind of redid his test to validate them, and basically what I ended up seeing the same thing he did. Using a Vhdx file with Pvs is the time it takes to create a new Vdisk image is almost cut in half. So from with a VHD it was 650 seconds, with a Vhdx it's about 350. IOPS was also lower when you're looking at these, from 17 IOPS down to about 12, but just by going to a Vhdx file. And then finally, the disk throughput was higher, and this is better. You get more disk throughput. You get more stuff going through your disk. Vhdx was almost twice as high as a VHD. So you're getting better performance out of your disk just by going with the Vhdx file format with Pvs master images. So this now, we talked MCS, we talked Pvs, and this brings us back to the MCS versus Pvs debate. And I'd like to take credit for starting this debate many, many, many years ago in 2011. It was the 23rd season of The Simpsons was in 2011, and Citrix came out with an alternative to Pvs that was supposed to be easier, and that was MCS. It was simple. It was integrated within the FMA architecture, the 7.x environment. So people started asking this question: what's better, MCS or Pvs? So I went ahead and created this decision tree to help. And I think I figured last time I showed this, but it was in an audience, and a lot of people were familiar with this decision tree. And the problem is people still use this. It's been 5 years. Things have changed significantly. All those MCS Pvs things I just showed happened within like the last 7 months. So just think about 5 years. Things have changed. So the first thing is, don't use this anymore. I even have it on my blog sites like, this is completely out of date. Here's the new one. This is basically what we came up with, is looking at the capabilities of MCS and Pvs. As you can see, they're very equal. Some of the differences which you can point out is MCS can do full clones, Pvs can do physical machines. MCS can do cloud, like Azure and AWS. But Pvs has the fast updates, the instantaneous rollback, and makes it very easy to synchronize images across geographies. I just copy a Vdisk image, I copy a file to another location, and I'm done. Whereas MCS, you're working in the hypervisor, exporting and importing VHD files. So that's basically, you start using this to try to figure out where do you want to go down the Pvs and MCS route. They're both completely viable, especially with the RAM-based read and write caching. They both scale. They both work. They're actually both easy to deploy, and Pvs is very easy to deploy now as well. I'm starting around on time. I got to speed up even more. So Zen Server. So how Zen Server was, all these processes were in the same, think of it as the same priority. You have system-level processes, VM-level processes. They were all prioritized the same. So in the last version of Zen Server, they added this whole, they're utilizing a Linux concept called C groups, where you can basically group different processes into different C groups, which have different priorities when it comes to CPU and RAM allocation. And essentially, doing this, what it did is had a huge impact on boot storms. So this is the time to start an individual VM. I think it was like 125 VMs. So each one of those VMs is a dot. Each 125, there's 125 dots in there for each of those colors. It shows each of those VMs how long it took to start during a boot storm. The green line is with C groups. So as you can see, even though there's a boot storm, it didn't impact the boot time. They're all right around 100 seconds. But all the earlier versions, as well as the current version without a C group, the boot times increase because the system, you don't have enough resources for the system level processes. So Zen Server 7, has that, integrates that functionality of C groups that's on by default. There's nothing you can config. It just should help improve performance, especially when you start running low on resources or when you're hitting your resources really hard and there could be potential bottlenecks. So we've done what's new, we've done what's better. A lot of things have improved, Pvs, MCS, zones, a lot of different things are now. Let's talk a little bit on what's best, some of the new best practices that have come out. So this isn't a new best practice, but there's a new thing to think about when it comes to this best practice. So the best practice is your app and your data should be in the same place. And you know what? We've talked about this. Anyone who's been doing, XenApp and XenDesktop for a decade or so knows that. ICA, the user doesn't have to be near the application because ICA can handle a slow or high latent WAN link. Your app and your data have to communicate across the network. If you have low bandwidth or high latency between your app and your data, the application performance is going to degrade because the application is waiting on the data to come back. So that's why you want to keep your app and your backend data together. We talked about this numerous times. But let's look at it from the perspective of zone preferences. So we talked about zone preferences as being, something that's been improved. And let's go through an example here. So we have two sites, a North America zone and a Europe zone. And you can see different resources, and some of those resources have data. So there's Windows 10 desktops in both sites. They have user profile data. There's a browser app in both sites, and there's an AppX, just another application that has its own data. So what happens if my user, my North America user, is in North America? What resources should I use? They should use Windows 10. That's based on the user's home, because I have data, my user profile, that's specific to my user. That is the user's home. That data will always be there. The browser app has no data. We're going to base that on the user's location, so it's the user's location which will be the zone preference for that particular app. And then we have the AppX application, which has application-specific data regardless of the user. Now, it's only located in the Europe zone, but we would use an app home for that particular application. So for Windows 10 desktops, you want the user home. For the browser app, you want a user location, and for AppX, you want a app home. So this is how you look at the three different ways to define your zone preference. So now, if this user is in Europe, they're still a North America user, but they're traveling, they still will go back to their Windows 10 desktop in North America, even though it's farther away, but their data is there, so the desktop should run pretty well. The AppX app will continue to run in Europe because the data is there. We don't want to run anywhere else. Now, the browser app is also going to run in Europe. There's no data associated with it, but based on the user location, I want that to run local of where the user is, because it will give them the better experience. So if you look at, there's different ways you could do this. The old way without zone preferences, you create a published app for AppX. You create two for Windows 10, one in North America, one in Europe, and you create two for your other apps. Let's say Workday, North America and Europe. That's the one that has no backend data. And it's up to the user to determine these are the ones I want to use. Or with zone preferences, you get rid of the location-based names on these, and you just have the app name. And you don't confuse the user about which one they want to use. They just pick which app or which resource. So the configuration of this, when you look at this, is that you go into the zones, and what you're going to see is you have two different zones configured, North America and Europe. They both have delivery controllers. They both have host connections, for the hypervisors, and they both have machine catalogs. Windows 10 machine catalogs as well as 2012 R2 machine catalogs. They're located in those different geographies. I then look at my delivery groups, and again, I have two different delivery groups, one for Windows 10 and one for 2012 R2. So in the Windows 10 delivery group, when you look in the user section, at the bottom there it says sessions must launch in the user's home zone if it's configured. Okay, so I am specifying that this resource should launch in the user's home zone. We'll configure the user's home zone later what it is, but that's where you set it for a particular resource. The application host, on the other hand, when we look in here, we have different applications. So that one app delivery group has AppX and Workday as applications. So for the AppX application, I will set a zone of Europe, and I'm going to say only this app can only launch in this zone. So now I'm restricting that app to that single zone because that's where the data is. I don't want that app running anywhere else because the data is not there, or there might be security or compliance reasons why that app should not be running anywhere else but Europe. For the Workday app, this is the app that doesn't have any backend data. You then specify there is no home zone for this app, and don't even use the user's home zone. So the app doesn't have a home zone, and I want you to ignore the user's home zone for this app as well. So then it's basically going to use the user's location with, using Netscaler. So those are the different areas where you configure it. The last thing is to configure the user's home location that goes, with the user's home. And this is just using Active Directory groups. So we would specify, I might have an AD group called Europe users, another one called North America users, and each one of those users is added into those particular Active Directory groups, and the zones will be able to use that information to figure out, okay, if these users in NA, that means their home location is North America, and I'm going to make sure they only go to those resources. So that's the changes with zone preferences and how it fits in the best practices. The next example is optimizations. We want to make sure we optimize the environment as a best practice, but don't go crazy with it. Optimize kind of responsibly here. The first thing is boot optimization. So we talked about RAM cache on the Pvs side, and this is the difference it has. And there's really nothing to configure. It's just making sure your Pvs servers have enough RAM. And it doesn't take much. It's like every image you're going to deliver from Pvs, give your Pvs server 2 more gigs of RAM. So if I'm going to deliver 1 image, it should be my OS for the Pvs plus 2 gig. If I have 4 images, it's how much RAM I need for Pvs plus 4 times 2, which would be 8 gig for 4 images. And what you can basically see is if you don't configure, if you don't have enough RAM, that means you're not going to be able to have this server-side RAM-based cache. And your boot times take a little bit longer, 58 seconds. If you have enough RAM, it's all stored in RAM, so I don't have to go back out to storage and read, which means my boot times for these devices drop to 14 seconds. I didn't change anything. I'm just using RAM. And what you end up seeing is the throughput went from 4,000 kilobytes a second up to 18,000 kilobytes a second, because that's the power of RAM, of using a RAM-based read cache. The other thing that we had was, a lot of people like to get into ports and threads on Pvs, on how to best optimize ports and threads. And what we found out was, one of our consultants went through this and figured out threads should equal how many virtual CPUs your Pvs server has. So if I have an 8 virtual CPU Pvs server, I have 8 threads. Now, how many ports I want to specify, you should divide the number of targets, how many devices you will stream to, divided by the number of threads. And that tells you how many ports you will get. So the graph here is showing different examples and how long it took to boot the first 10 targets versus the last 10 targets from a Pvs server. And this is the formula that got us the best boot performance for all the tests. So here's what makes things interesting about Pvs. Pvs is not CPU intensive. It doesn't hit the CPU very hard. It hits the network hard. So you could technically get by with a 2 virtual CPU Pvs server and stream hundreds of target devices. However, doing that means you have fewer threads, which would then equate to I now must have more ports defined on the network for Pvs that Pvs can use. And those ports have to be contiguous, right in a line, no spaces. So Pvs doesn't necessarily need 8 virtual CPUs, but typically we go with 8 virtual CPUs because it gives us more threads that Pvs will then be able to, we won't need as many ports on the network to be able to get a good performance. So you'll be able to, overcommit CPUs a lot more on your hypervisor when you're just doing Pvs, because you're not fully utilizing those CPUs on a Pvs server. We're really only having multiple CPUs to give us more threads that we'll be able to work with. And I believe the last example in optimization is Logon Performance. And so, we took a look at, there's lots of different ways you can optimize the environment. We have, and we want to see how these optimizations would impact how long it takes to log on. Default, is your 100% time. When we removed Windows 10 default apps, we took off 10% of a logon time. When we optimized services, it dropped like another 5%. Changing scheduled tasks and runtime didn't do anything, but implementing Citrix UPM dropped it even more. And then implementing the RAM-based write cache dropped logon time even more. So we were actually able to drop like a 60-second logon time down to less than 30 seconds by doing these type of activities. So remove unwanted apps, implement UPM, and of course the RAM-based write cache. So again, optimizations are important from a user experience perspective. But things to keep in mind with all this is, keep your apps and data together. You want to optimize. You want to optimize the environment, but make sure you're doing it correctly. Don't go too far. MCS really has graduated. It has the RAM-based caching, a lot of different functionality in there. I mean, it's a viable imaging solution for many people, as well. Just like Pvs. Hdx Adaptive Display helps simplify our codec selection, where we don't have to decide anymore. We let it do it for us. Regardless of where you are in the world, you can get to the right resource, the one that's going to give you the best experience based on app data, based on user data, or based on user location, so by using the zone preference feature. The VDI handbook, it's very soon. It's coming out very, very, very soon. So keep your eyes open for that. And then finally, those of you who use Visio, I maintain the Visio stencils on my site. So feel free to go out there and grab the new ones. I think I do have changes for 7.11 I haven't posted yet, so stay tuned for that soon. But that is all of them, and wow, that took the whole hour.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's great. Stephanie, how are we doing time-wise? Are we willing to hang on here for a little bit longer so that we can field at least some of the questions? We have a boatload of them, so obviously, even if we do spend some additional time, there's absolutely no way we can cover all of them.
Yeah, I think we can take a few. And then what I was going to ask Daniel is if the ones that we don't get to, if I can send those to you and maybe you can answer them real quickly and I can post them in the forum under the event thread that we created, and then that way you can go there.
Yeah, I think that's what we did last time as well. I think that worked pretty well.
Okay,
so I think some of these I might have to look up.
Okay, so Tobias, if you want to pick out just a handful, and then then we'll push the rest over to the forum and get those out there.
Sure, I'd be more than glad to. I mean, clearly we covered a lot of territory today, and there were certainly a number of questions that came in that fell in certain categories. So I will try and consolidate those to some degree. I just wanted to note that, asking, I think, users here which one is your favorite new feature is almost like asking who is your favorite Simpson character. So it's almost impossible to really, tell one from the other. Okay, well, let's start with single sign-on. First of all, there was a question at the very, very beginning that had to do with whether or not that federated authentication service as a service model will work in conjunction with multi-tenacity and DAAS.
Let's see. So if you would use the federated authentication service in a desktop as a service, I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to understand the question.
I guess the question is, it sounds like you have to use a federated authentication mechanism regardless in order for this to work. And so the question is, will it integrate also with the desktop as a service model with multi-tenacity?
Yeah, so with the DAS model, unless you're going to deploy your Active Directory into the cloud and extend it in the cloud, you're going to have to authenticate to something. And so if you look at, so let's do an example of like Azure. And let's say we're going to have a desktop up in Azure and use Azure Active Directory. That is not Active Directory. So if you would want to integrate that with your local Active Directory, you would have to set up the federated authentication service, as I understand it.
Another one is, can you confirm if FAS enablement also contains SAML-based user security context transition to VDA? Apparently it was supposed to address geolocation, but the user says that they can't find any information about it and SAML, and whether NetScaler converts the original ticket to its own under those circumstances.
No idea on that one. That one I gotta find out from probably from Joe Nord. He's the security wizard. That goes well beyond my knowledge.
Here's a good one. Interest whether if and when the North Scale integration is going to take place. I mean, clearly the announcement is so new that it's not going to be, immediate. But any thoughts or ideas about when that might take place?
No, unfortunately, and I wouldn't be able to say anyways. But I mean, they are going to integrate it. When? No idea.
Okay. Is HTML5 redirection included in this distribution?
I don't believe so. No,
I don't recall seeing anything in the release notes about that either.
Yeah.
How about is Hdx Adaptive Additional Composition mode available besides the native H.264 and enhanced compatibility?
Adaptive additional.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what that means exactly either.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, not sure on that one.
There was also a little bit of confusion about the self-service password reset. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that requires the Platinum Edition.
Oh boy. Boy, now you guys are getting into licensing.
Everybody's favorite.
I need a PMM on the call with me now. I'm a techie.
my recollection was I believed that was a requirement. I tried to reply privately to the users, but we should probably verify if that is indeed the case.
I think it is, but I'm not 100% sure on what features come in which edition.
Right, exactly. The other question, let's go to data monitoring. There were a number of questions regarding historical retention times, such as can the limit be extended beyond 90 days, or is that the absolute hard cutoff?
No, I believe it. I believe it continues. I believe you can continue beyond 90 days.
It may be user configurable. I can't remember. One thing I do recall reading is that I think in the enterprise version that you do not have the ability to retain as long as you can in the platinum version. But I'm not sure what the exact numbers are on that either.
Yeah.
Let's see what else do we have here. Gosh, a lot of questions. Let's see. One question was, in order to make use of Vhdx as a storage protocol, which hypervisors actually support that right now?
So the Vhdx that was let's see, that was from the Pvs perspective,
Right.
and that's just the file format of the Pvs Vdisk image itself that it's contained in. So it would work across any hypervisor because that Vhdx file isn't actually being used on the different hypervisors. It's only being read by the Pvs server.
Right, because even Zen Server currently does not support Vhdx as a native VDI.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Is there still a limit of 4 Pvs boot servers?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. Will the updated BDM partitions work both for VMware as well as Zen Server?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe it works on all the hypervisors.
Okay. There was also concern about how large the excuse me, the cache would grow on local hypervisor resources if you enable the read caching mechanism?
Oh, the Zen Server read cache?
Yes. In terms of, of sizing and what happens if you run out, does it then start, getting rid of the oldest one and so forth?
Yeah, that's exactly what it does. So it's just going to, Zen Server is going to make DOM0 like around 4 gig, and it's just going to use whatever free memory is there. It'll use that as a read cache, and then again, if it starts running out and it's reading more, it gets rid of the old stuff and brings in new stuff.
Right, and if you have a lot of RAM available, I think you can actually increase DOM0 up to something like 32 gigabytes now. It can be made actually that's quite large.
That's right. And it's similar on Pvs read cache because it's just using Windows to do it as well. And I would think that the recommendation we have is, estimate 2 gigs of RAM for each unique image. That's what we do on the Pvs side. So it brings about an interesting design topic with MCS, is that if I have 2 different desktop images, would I want to spread the VMs that are using those images, put them on separate hypervisors so that my Zen Server's RAM-based read cache would only be caching 1 image instead of 2 or 3 images? Right. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Is this feature going to be supported under VMware as well?
So it's a hypervisor deal. So of course, it works on Zen Server. It's a Zen Server. It's a Zen Server feature, not an MCS feature. There is on the Hyper-V side, if you use what's it called, CSV cache, and you can have a RAM-based CSV cache. And I don't know if vSphere has a RAM-based cache as well on the hypervisor, because there's really nothing in MCS that's doing it. It's the hypervisor itself that does it.
Okay. Let's go over to some questions regarding zones. So will zone preference work with multiple sites, or do you need a single site spanning zones?
The zone preference is for a single site, so a single database that's spread across multiple sites. It wouldn't work if you had separate XenApp, XenDesktop installations, that were completely separate from each other.
Okay, that makes sense. There's also a question when the next Ltsr version is going to be released. I don't think anybody, at least publicly, knows.
No. I hope it's a while, because then I have to do another VDI handbook.
So here's an interesting one that intrigued me a little bit. So if you do an MCS full clone, approach, is that going to change anything in terms of the IOPS that your system is going to have to be able to deal with, or is it simply just a question of spreading it out differently because of the way that the disk structure is organized?
Yeah, I think it's spreading it out differently, because even with it as now the thin clone, you're reading and writing, but those reads and writes go different places. You know what? There's a potential that there could be a slight decrease in reads, because the way it is now with the thin, you have the master image and the differencing disk, and so all the writes are going to go into the differencing disk. I mean, that's easy. The writes won't change. But the reads, it has to figure out, do I read it's going to try to read from the differencing disk first. If it doesn't exist there, then it has to go read from the master disk. And so you might every so often have double reads with a thin provision, but with a thick provisioned, it's just reading and writing from the same spot. So there's a potential that you would decrease reads, but no one cares too much about reads.
Right.
It's always more about the write.
So what happens on the storage itself? Say you have a thin provisioned, NFS kind of disk. Is there going to be a substantial difference with the actual storage allocation, depending then on whether you use a thin provisioned circumstance or a full clone?
Most likely, yes. The caveat is, so if you're doing a thin provisioned pooled desktop, that you reboot and the differencing disk goes away, then you go to this full clone, which is a dedicated desktop. They're different types of desktops. One's a pooled, one's a dedicated. So massive difference in storage allocation.
Yes. So basically, even if you put it on a thin provisioned disk, you're not going to actually get the thin provisioning with the full clone.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, I believe so.
That's right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
VMware, or sorry. Let's see. Okay. Regarding zones, going back to zones again, the user says they're still waiting for a kind of a replication to satellite zones in the event that the WAN connection goes down. Is that on the radar?
Yeah. So, I mean, right now there's the whole connection leasing portion of it, and there's other things that are being discussed. So the connection leasing would support if a WAN link went down for different sites, that were different zones, and that's just capturing in an XML file on your local controllers of resources the users already accessed before. And so if the WAN link goes down, they try to get to those resources again. It's going to figure out, it's like, okay, this person's accessed this before. We're going to let them access it again because they probably still have rights. It doesn't work for every resource, but that's what there is right now, connection leasing. But there is discussions on other options. So that's kind of one of those wait and see.
Okay, great. Well, let's do one more, and then we'll let you go. Otherwise, we'll be here forever. Do the new RAM cache options in MCS also support personal Vdisks?
No. Or wait. I'm trying to visualize the GUI. I don't think so, because the writes that go into RAM is volatile. And if power goes out, you lose it.
Oh yeah. Well, that makes good sense.
And so you could, it would mess things up if you did PVD.
That makes total sense. Well, I think at this point, again, as Stephanie mentioned earlier, if there are additional questions and interest that have not been covered here, please do feel free to go to the mycugc.org site, specifically to the link that was posted earlier that relates to this specific presentation, where this discussion can be continued. I certainly encourage everyone to continue to follow up on all the new developments going on at myCUGC. And I'll let Stephanie sign off on behalf of everyone, but let me first give my thanks, first of all, to Daniel for his always very entertaining presentations. He usually does what I call PowerPoint movies instead of PowerPoint presentations, because he's always got so much exciting and interesting stuff to present. And with that, thank you again, Stephanie, and I will hand it back to you.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Tobias. Thanks, Daniel. As you mentioned, there is a forum thread open at mycugc.org. We'd love you to share your feedback, type in more questions, and Daniel, I will get you all of the questions that were asked as soon as this is done. I'll send those over to you, and you can pick out the ones you'd like to answer, and we'll post them in the forum for you. Also want to let everyone know that you'll be getting an email tomorrow with a link to the forum thread, a link to the recording of today's presentation, and also to a survey. I've also thrown the survey link in the chat window if you want to go ahead and fill it out today. It's very short, but it helps us continue to plan content for CUGC. So with that, I want to thank you all again. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Tobias. And everybody have a great day.